Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And we have Emily Jashinsky once a month. I'm going to drop that "and" every time now, Emily. But Emily is a senior fellow with us at IWF. She is also the culture editor over at The Federalist. She has a show on Crystal and Sagar's Breaking Points called Counterpoints with Ryan Grimm. So you can hear her. Is it every Wednesday?
Every Wednesday. That's
every
right.
Wednesday. You can hear her take on whatever the news is that Wednesday. But this Wednesday, she's here with me at High Noon. So Emily, welcome back.
Thanks for having me in this.
We have some politics stuff to get to, DeSantis, the border. But I actually want to start with a little cultural tidbit that is bouncing around my feed right now. Bryan Johnson, who is this Silicon Valley guy who has made a crap ton of money and has decided that he's going to dedicate the rest of his life to the project of not dying before we hit the singularity. You can tell in the way I'm describing this that this is a large part of what I have a problem with, the Silicon Valley mentality. But there's this clip of him bouncing around, and I think it's worth discussing exactly because I think so many people in Silicon Valley, and then increasingly of our elite class, think this actually sounds reasonable. So I'm going to play it and get your thoughts.
Like the last moment where like things kind of have been how they have been, but they're about to change radically. And in this new future, we can't predict what's going to happen. We no longer have that ability. And so we're living in a zeroth world. And so Gen Zero is a group of multi-ethnic, multinational people who rise up and they say, we are willing to courageously step into the future. And we're willing to divorce or open to divorce from ourselves all human norms, all human customs, all human thought. And we're willing to say we're wide open about everything. Absolute blank slate.
So, Emily, what do you think about Generation Zero?
You and I could probably dissect that clip for 3 hours because he packed so much nonsense into it. But I was listening to it earlier today before we taped, actually, not even knowing this was sort of bouncing around in your head as well. But it does sound like a lot of the people who came after Nietzsche. And we've talked about this before. But to me, maybe it's because I was just listening to Rest is History earlier today and their conversation about the actual like worldview and sort of belief system that Hitler and a lot of Nazis had. But this idea that we are going to throw off all human norms and start from basically a blank slate and invent our own morality. And of course, you know, the Nazis were looking back to Rome and looking back to what they saw as like the great Aryan race of the past, whatever. But this idea that we're at a blank slate, that because of technology, that because of increasing knowledge, you know, maybe it's Darwin in the 1930s to people who are thinking of these things, it sounds like eugenics, or it sounds like what led to eugenics, and not just in Germany. It sounds like what led to the eugenics of people like Margaret Sanger. And I think the problem, Inez, would be underestimating people like Bryan Johnson, because Bryan Johnson is listening to the counter arguments. Bryan Johnson has hubris that tells him he understands all of the best arguments against his own argument. He's not a head in the sand Hillary Clinton person where, you know, Hillary Clinton would never click on a Federalist link, that's for damn sure. But, you know, he has the sort of hubris to confront what he sees as the toughest arguments against him. So it's not that he's not sort of listening, and it's not that, you know, some of these techno optimists, I'm thinking like Mark Andreessen, aren't listening. But it is that they think that they're too good to kind of worry about, that their ideas are so strong that they don't really have to worry about the opposition. And again, Inez, like that's a really frightening, it's like what you're talking about, the Nazis confronting the cult of Mount Sinai, right? That the 10 Commandments had, you know, the Jews had used the 10 Commandments to corrupt the human race essentially into kindness and like miscegenation and like all of these things that they thought were weakening the race. This is laying the groundwork. It may sound novel and invigorating right now, because it's true, it's fertile soil for these types of ideas to spring forth from, because so many things are being deconstructed and so many things are becoming possible by new technologies. But thrusting full steam ahead into anti-humanism is horrifying. Truly, truly horrifying. And maybe you could put Hitler again in that camp, because he was so, or out of that camp, because he was so pro-human that it was all about the will to power. And that's the most, that's fallen man's most base instinct, is to just survive and preserve the race, and et cetera, as they saw it. But on another level, it leads to pain and suffering and unhappiness. And I think old BJ here is going to the same spot.
What really just blows my mind about the way that he's talking is he thinks he's the first one to think this way. And I don't know how much of that is a kind of, and you and I talked about this on your Federalist Radio podcast, but a kind of sort of background hum of not just being irreligious or atheistic, but of being post-religious, of not taking seriously any that civilizations of the past may have have asked some of the same questions and may have had answers, or at least offered answers that are worth considering in modern life. There's just none of that, and so it comes off as ridiculous, because anybody who knows a little bit about either human history of civilizations, even of the 20th century, as you're pointing out, I mean, there's certainly a sort of ring of Pol Pot to this in a certain way, but also like an intellectual history, right? And it's not that he's advancing these ideas in an understanding and trying to, for example, distinguish himself from Pol Pot and say, no, like this is different and here's why, is that he doesn't even know that he's repeating things, right? And that is truly terrifying in somebody who purports to be an elite, right? And especially somebody who wants to have such a large hand in guiding human affairs into the future. But just to steelman his argument a little much better than he does here.
Let's do it.
So, I mean, you like to talk a lot about hypernovelty, right? About the speed and rapidity of technological change, surpassing human speed of adaptation, that we're a very adaptable species. We can adapt to a lot of things, but that the rate of change, essentially, it's not the technological change itself, which is to some extent nothing new, but the rate of change has gotten so quick that human affairs or civilization cannot really keep up with that. So in other words, is there something different about this moment? Is it possible that like technological advancement actually is making, I know we talk a lot about human beings becoming obsolete vis-a-vis AI or whatever else, but this is a slightly different question. Is it making human nature obsolete? Are we going to change so radically in response to these technologies that maybe what he's saying here has a little bit of a point, right? That a lot of the premises that seem similar, we have all of these wildly different ways that man has arranged civilization going back, let's say, even to the Romans, forget about before that, right? Some things that are massively in contradiction with each other: polygamous societies, monogamous societies, right? Christian societies, pagan societies, all these societies have functioned in different ways, different parts of the world, radically different cultures. And the way that we make sense of all of that is to pull out a few threads that say, okay, human beings can be very different in very different cultures and times, but here's a few things that are, at least conservatives, the constrained view would say, here's a few things that haven't changed about our nature. Everything else around it might change. It might be applied in different ways to different problems, to different challenges, different instabilities, different opportunities, but these things don't change. When you start to talk about transhumanism or, some of the ways that come naturally, I think, to a lot of Silicon Valley people to talk about these questions, at what point, is there a point where we can actually make any observations? Can we make conservatism obsolete in that sense?
How do you mean conservatism? Like the sort of fundamental conservation of the good, the true, the beautiful?
I guess I should define that, because I have this to me seems a very simple definition of being conservative versus being either leftist or radical, depending on how you. But to me, I really like Sowell's constrained versus unconstrained view. That conservatives have the constrained view, and I think basically conservatives are those people who think that there is something stable about human nature that cannot be transformed. So that's a specific sense in which I meant, can it make conservatism obsolete? In other words, can technology change us as human beings so dramatically that conservative observations about human nature that have held, even though we've had all these different societies all over, throughout time and all over the globe, there's still been some things that have held steady about human nature. Can we transform even those things? Are we getting to a point where he's arguing even those things are no longer stable and we need to operate differently, as though human beings really can be transformed even in our natures?
He acknowledges a very true premise, or the very true premise to his entire argument in that interview, which is that we literally know nothing about what's going to come. And he says because of that, we must shed the sort of burdensome scruples that have governed societies since time immemorial. And what's interesting about that is it's kind of a self-defeating argument that we know nothing, so we should absolutely embrace this one prescription. And to the point that you're making here, this is like the easiest question in the world to answer as a believing Christian, because man is fallen, and if man is programming the technology of the future, if man is fundamentally, if human nature informs the technology ahead, it can't be, perfected. We can't perfect human nature. Human nature cannot itself perfect human nature because it's human. It's fundamentally human. So that's a really, I think, obvious problem. I don't think any technology is going to correct the impulse of sin, or the sort of the will, the selfishness of man. And what we've discovered, if anything, in a hyper connected world where everyone essentially lives next to each other and does politics next to each other, because the time that it takes for me in DC to talk to you in New York, or the time it takes to see the destruction on October 7th, I mean, some of that we were basically seeing happen live from all different corners of the globe. And so one thing that we've learned is even that these sort of Western standards that we've developed to moderate human behavior, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Here's how we're going to deal with it. That these sort of things are more important than ever before, because we're not in tight-knit villages. Hypernovelty has sort of ripped us really quickly away from those tight-knit villages. And we have to be governed by the sort of standards that temper our will, our sinful impulses, our selfishness, rather than sort of throwing off these shackles and descending into this Nietzschean anarchy. That's, like, to me, more than anything, that's horrifying, because now man can do so much destruction so quickly, and our impulses are not tempered in that sort of, if you look at the anarchy that is the internet right now, in some places that are still kind of unregulated, you see exactly what it means. It doesn't mean that those spaces should be regulated. It just means that people have massive power to, spread legitimate disinformation, or like hack. We've seen horrifying hacks of national security proportions of people's livelihoods, their bank accounts. All of this stuff can happen really quickly with a click of a few buttons. So I think, if anything, hypernovelty has put us in a situation where we need to hold fast to these sort of standards, both of freedom and the restrictions of certain freedoms for the sake of preserving the other freedoms. Not to sound like the FBI. I don't mean it that way. I mean it in the sort of Madisonian sense.
Yeah, there's sort of a failure to appreciate that things can always get worse. Which I guess is the great conservative insight.
Well, but it's the same thing with, like, if you look at Mark Andreessen, he is now embracing this optimistic accelerationist worldview, and he's sort of codified it, and maybe codified is the wrong word, but he's sort of made it coherent. Or attempted to make it into a coherent movement that is A, optimistic, and B, accelerationist. And unless your optimism, again, I'm just speaking as a Christian, unless your optimism is in the eternal, there's really no reason for optimism on earth. It's like saying stupid things as though the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That is idiotic. That is such a ridiculous line from somebody who's ordained, nonetheless. But again, I'm just speaking from that perspective. And optimism, to sort of embrace the cult of optimism right now is insane from my perspective. And I understand that they're right about some of the pessimism. I get that. And I think that's what's making it really powerful. At the same time, a blind optimism is rooted in an arrogance. And I think when you look at the writings, and I really respect Mark Andreessen, I just think when you look at the writings of people in the accelerationist optimist space, there's a real arrogance to it that I don't think is well founded.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree. Even sort of accelerationists on my own side, who I agree with their politics, and the prescription is, well, just let this regime collapse, and that's the only way in which we're going to be able to build something better. I cringe away from. It seems like, again, a failure to appreciate that things can always get worse. There is sort of a Tower of Babel feel to all of this. But something specific you said we can't get away from, like, we can't innovate around sin in the crooked timber of humanity. And again, just to steelman this, like, I actually agree with this worldview very much, but just to steelman this, is it possible that we can? I mean, if you think about something like Ozempic, which doesn't just make people lose weight, it also stops them from biting their nails. It stops them from doom scrolling. So it does something to stop people who drink too much. It, like, how they cut back their drinking. It seems to do something to the mechanism of sort of self-destructive behaviors itself. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced, to your point about pessimism and optimism being ill-founded. I'm absolutely convinced that we're going to discover this is, like, going to give everybody horrible stomach cancer or something. But as of now, it looks like we have some data, and that's almost more disturbing in itself. I guess the question is, even if we could innovate around sin or people's bad behaviors or immoral behaviors even, would we through that completely lose our humanity as well? And maybe to somebody like Bryan Johnson, that sounds like just fine. He doesn't want to die either. He's trying not to die. So anything related to our humanity and our frailty, I guess to steelman this, like, why are we clinging to this, right? Why are we clinging to and defining our humanity through our various flaws and sufferings?
I think Ozempic is actually the perfect example for a couple of reasons. And one of them is, if you're taking it to get away from, like, gluttony, and maybe even just thinking of that in a sense of gluttony as not only something that can lead to health problems, but as a sin. And let's say gluttony in this sense is something that Ozempic can actually sort of perfect, as we were talking about, like, can technology in some ways actually, like, finally perfect human nature and allow us all to live in peace and harmony, in a real utopian sense, as they sort of have these discussions. But again, I think that's a really good example. And one of the reasons is, are people taking Ozempic for material concerns, to address material concerns, or are they really taking it to address the follies of gluttony, the, in some ways, material, but also spiritual follies of gluttony? And I would argue almost everyone who's taking Ozempic is doing it just simply to lose weight, look better. As a, and for some people, again, this is a very real medical treatment. I'm not talking about that. On the other hand, I also think it's a good example of the Band-Aids that technology is allowing us to apply. So you sort of temporarily patch up a problem. Actually, even a better analogy is probably patching up, holes in a boat, something like that, because that's like another way that I see Ozempic is it making you healthier than developing discipline? And again, I'm not judging anybody, because I think it's an amazing new medication. But I'm just saying, we all know objectively it would be best if we were able to sort of psychologically over time master a sense of self-discipline and work out and have a sort of daily lifestyle that mirrored the natural conditions that the human body, as Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying have documented in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, that the human body is meant to live in, that optimizes human health. Would it be better to sort of mirror that kind of hunter-gathering daily lifestyle by moving, by working our muscles, by eating natural foods and enjoying sunlight, all of those different things? Would that be ideal? I think virtually everyone would say yes. And so again, these like temporary patches, what we're going to end up with, and Bryan Johnson is the living embodiment of this, sadly. He does not look good for his age, and his entire worldview is premised on looking young for his age, and the exact embodiment of the patchwork solution to the problems of human nature. The physical embodiment of it is Bryan Johnson, who looks like a patchwork, and who says when he stops treatment, certain types of treatment for a couple of days, his aging accelerates rapidly. Then you need to patch another Band-Aid on top of that, and another patch on top of that, and by the end of the day, you're this techno Frankenstein. And I don't think anyone would argue that that is actually better for your health and happiness.
I mean, I think people do.
They do. I just mean any like sane person.
I don't know. There's also like this loss. And this is probably something you absolutely cannot agree with as a Christian. But like, I think there would be a loss somehow if we were to strip sin from humanity, right? Like, how many geniuses or artists, famous artists, had like well-balanced lives, free of self-destructive tendencies, of like that those things sometimes spur people to great heights. And I can imagine a kind of middling world where everyone is free of these kinds of sufferings, or even of certain moral flaws, right? And I can imagine that being a worse world than the one we have. Like, think about, I think the sci-fi Firefly, so the movie that wraps it up and explains some things about the series, because they cut it off early, is called Serenity. And Ozempic, for example, really, really reminded me of this. So they're terraforming planets. It's a sci-fi. They put millions of people on this planet. But to correct for the messiness and chaos of human civilization and of human beings themselves, they add something to the atmosphere, basically to keep people calm, right? To like sort of to lessen their aggressive instincts. And what they end up with is an entire world of people who just don't see the point in exerting themselves to live, and just lie down and die. They all starve to death. They all die. Like, they just lie down and go to sleep and are not interested in scratching out a life, right? That like messing with that very basic human instinct turns out to have enormous consequences. And I that is what freaks me out about Ozempic, because what you're saying would, to me, make more sense as an objection if Ozempic was merely taking the consequences. In other words, people were continuing to be gluttonous, but it wasn't showing up on their bodies, right? But increasingly, what it seems like is that Ozempic is taking away the compulsion to eat. And
in terms of eating,
some people have that compulsion that comes out in gluttony, and then they become very fat. But it seems to have a similar effect on other compulsions. Okay, so I guess what would happen to Picasso if we took away his compulsions? Would we have, anyway, we're getting into very, very deep and far water here, but I do think there's this temptation to think that because we are going through a massive both economic and technological transformation period, that therefore the past has nothing to teach us anymore, and that these canards about human nature, I can imagine Bryan Johnson, dismissing both of us and saying, well, these are just some of the preconceptions that Generation Zero needs to sweep away because we're proceeding towards a singularity. Human beings themselves will be very different in 20 years and 50 years. He's constantly talking, by the way, about like what somebody 200 years from now will think of him versus what anyone thinks of him today. He's like obviously very unconcerned that his attempt not to die seems ridiculous to most people. But I don't know, like again, as a conservative, you look back and you realize people have thought this before. Like, you're not the first, dude. You're not the first to think that there's this hard break in humanity coming and that you're going to be the one to be ahead of it. And we have a long line of people who have thought very similarly, of course, for different sets of circumstances and confronting different technologies and different societal upheavals. But we have a long record of people thinking more or less what you are thinking right now. And most of those people do not get remembered fondly in 200 years.
Well, yeah, and I mean, again, I'm going to tug one more time at the Ozempic cord just to say I think where you're going with that is super interesting, because to me, Bryan Johnson would say, I assume, why are you assuming gluttony is bad? Why are you assuming that we can't sort of patch up all of the different, health problems that come with obesity, diabetes, and blah, 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 and sort of have this Gnostic escape from the material bodily condition? This sounds like, you're living in the year 2000 when I'm living in the year 4000, and all of these preconceptions are, to your point, Inez, are totally irrelevant. And blah, blah, blah. But again, like, the pro-human take on that is our happiness is tied to these spiritual and material realities that will inform the construction of this new world order. And so back to the Ozempic example, if we keep, I think if we keep pulling at the thread, are people's compulsions going away? Sure. But to sort of paraphrase every girl on the Bachelor, are they going away for the right reasons? Are they sort of going in a direction that is just numbing these sort of spiritual concerns that give them these compulsions? And for people, it's all kinds of different reasons. People don't realize this, but my nails are chewed constantly to the bone, and have been since I was not to the bone, to the nub, and have been since I was like 4 years old. I've never stopped doing it, except for briefly when COVID first started spreading, and we were all terrified, but that didn't last super long, even though I wrote a piece about
for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, it had finally been cured. Yeah, exactly. But that's what I'm saying. Like, is this actually curing the spiritual ailment that is pushing the compulsion, or is it just patching up and helping you to ignore whatever sort of psychological, spiritual element it is, that no matter how much AI we have, and no matter how much of our lives are transferred into the metaverse, where we can look however we want, no matter how much of that we ultimately live in and around, you still aren't dealing with the deeper spiritual element of it just by taking Ozempic or whatever else. And it doesn't even have to technically be spiritual. Again, as a Christian, I gravitate and necessarily towards that. I'm just saying, even psychologically, that's you're still sort of patching up instead of dealing with the leak itself.
I mean, and you've pointed this out a bunch of times in various talks or speeches, but I think it is a really important insight of yours that I think more people need to pick it up. It is remarkable. Like, I'm trying to sit here thinking, how am I going to transfer this conversation to talking about, the border and Ron DeSantis? And you always point out, like, these things are totally orthogonal to our politics, right? It is like conducting politics essentially during you do start to get the feeling like conducting politics in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, right? Where you will end up with a whole series of revolutions and upheavals that at the time you can't see yet, and you keep like conducting politics as though it's very similar to what came before. And I guess that would be the softer version of Bryan Johnson's point that I find plausible in this current moment is, but yeah, like it seems like there's no way to move from this topic to what's happening at our border. I have
No, there is though. There's such a good link, which is that Ron DeSantis launched his campaign with David Sachs and Elon Musk. And it sort of has been seen as the metaphor. And there's a reason that I think, people like David Sachs are attracted to people like Ron DeSantis and RFK Jr. And that people like, not just David Sachs, but like some of the other all-in guys, and some people like Elon Musk are suddenly questioning DEI, or Bill Ackman is, suddenly horrified by DEI. I think in some ways it is because we've just patched ourselves up and numbed ourselves to hyper novelty. And some of the guys who were on the cutting edge of that, Elon Musk, Ron DeSantis, this like sort of traditional conservative, and I mean conservative in the sort of social sense in this context. There's a reason why there was a partnership between Elon Musk, who just launched Neuralink. He says that the first Neuralink was successfully implanted in a human, as we're taping this week, that he was attracted to Ron DeSantis. And I think Silicon Valley, your piece was so good in this on First Things. I think they're sort of flirting with and trying to reconcile some of what they've been on the cutting edge of by projecting it onto people like Ron DeSantis who are anti-woke, but they're not fully grasping, why they share this anti-woke impulse. And I don't know, Inez, if that was an effective transition. I'll let you be the judge.
A for effort. No, I mean, I actually see Ron DeSantis, interestingly, I see Ron DeSantis as kind of the last hope of traditional politics. And I mean that like in the capital P politics, not like his agenda is very much not what the Republican Party has been doing for 50 years. And I think that's why he's been successful. He's really made institutional warfare on the left, right? Via small d democratic politics in Florida. And I think he's done that really well. You can call it sort of, I think Chris Rufo also is very much in this mold. I think it's a very successful mode of politics, whatever one thinks about the Ron DeSantis campaign for president. And it's kind of my preferred direction, but there's a bit of, there's almost like a bit of hopefulness or optimism that I'm not sure is warranted, that's built into that structure. And I hope it's warranted. But it is actually just fully using the political tools available in a liberal democracy, right? As much as the left screeches about, our norms and our democracy and everything, the Ron DeSantis agenda and the things that Chris Rufo proposes are all ultimately working within what anybody in like 1958 or 1964 would have recognized as a liberal democracy. And so in a sense, it's like the most radical program that can be done to save us from the left within the current parameters of not just our like politics in terms of an Overton window, but in terms of our politics in terms of like the regime and the system itself. And the reason I hope that their bid succeeds, and the reason that I am sad to see Ron DeSantis perform so poorly, I think objectively on the national stage, is because that program seems to me to be our last best hope for a resolution to the divisions in this country and increasingly in the GAE, or the global American empire, because we're exporting a lot of this.
In the what, NS?
The GAE, global American empire. You've never heard this before?
I don't know. How do you pronounce that though? The what?
Mm-hmm.
The GAE. Got it. The online trolls know what we mean.
Yeah, know what they're doing. Yeah. No, but like, to me, it seems like the last solution that still, it seems very radical to people like David French, and he's like on a tear about it being a liberal and blah, blah, blah. But it actually isn't. It's using the small d democratic power to do very much what the left did over the course of the last 50 to 70 years in our institutions, right? It is essentially removing, either removing the law that was propping up a lot of what the left was doing, aggressively using appointments within various boards, aggressively using the power of the purse to advance, forgive me for simplicity, but good values over bad, like a vision of the good that is directly oppositional to the left's. But there's nothing that in that package that requires the total destruction of democracy, of some form of liberalism that would have been recognizable both to Thomas Jefferson and to people like right up until basically the 60s and 70s. There's no need to be quote unquote post-liberal to enact the Ron DeSantis, Chris Rufo agenda, right? And so I guess my hopes for that agenda, and which are lower than they have been because of the performance that Ron DeSantis put in, I see that very much as the last exit off a route that we really, really don't want to go on, where people have totally forgotten what it means when, for example, 75 million Trump supporters totally check out of politics and the political process as a legitimate way of resolving their differences and have no faith at all in any of the democratic institutions, any of the government institutions. I mean, this is not, I'll put it this way. Either it's going to be tyranny one way or it's going to be tyranny the other. If you get a critical mass of people who no longer see the current regime as protective of them, their fundamental, most basic interests, not even things, abstract things like rights, but their most basic interests, like, I don't know, not to be robbed and have their robbers go free, is a pretty basic one. Anyway, I don't see anything down that road that would make me happy or optimistic. And so that's how I kind of feel about the Ron DeSantis dropout thing. But how do you feel about it? I feel like you might have a more what do you call it? Like a realigned take, a realignment take.
No, I think there's something really interesting about what you've said, in that on the one hand, it feels like the last stand for normal politics, or for the sort of tradition of American liberalism, small L liberalism. And what's interesting about that is the people who have sort of profited off of picking at the carcass of American liberalism are arguably what tanked Ron DeSantis's campaign, which are the consultants. And, you know, we can go back and forth on this. Some people say, you know, Ron DeSantis could have had super based consultants, as, you know, some conservatives would demand, and he would, and I think he should have. You know, I don't think Jeff Rowe is a horrible choice. I don't know Jeff Rowe, but I think his track record should have given them, you know, a better idea of how this would end. And, you know, the consultant vultures were a huge part of his loss, whether or not Ron DeSantis, you know, was a perfect candidate, which he obviously wasn't. Even though he had so much momentum, it allowed people to think maybe he was the perfect foil to Trump and the perfect candidate to an extent that he wouldn't be. There was nothing he could have done about the lawfare. And so that's another separate conversation. But if you look at RCP's average between Trump and DeSantis, Donald Trump started the gulf between the two of them. So where DeSantis's numbers are going down and Trump's are going up actually came before DeSantis even launched his campaign. So again, that means he could have run a perfect campaign, but he still would have had to reverse that trend. It started when the lawfare started, like almost exactly, actually exactly, like basically to the day, as far as we can tell with polling. So that said, your liberalism point is fascinating, because I think what's illiberal is to be on the side of Joe Biden. And I'm using David French as an example. I have no idea what he says about Joe Biden or whether he's voting for Joe Biden, but you're right. Like, the politics is, as usual, the tradition of American small L liberalism is not allowing for this global concentration of elite power. And that's ultimately what Republican voters want to see in a candidate. It's almost exactly why Nikki Haley doesn't resonate with people. And it's something that Ron DeSantis was vocal about. It's something that Trump is vocal about, but people question whether or not he's able to execute on it. But I do think that's what, Elon Musk suddenly I shouldn't say suddenly, but taking an interest in criticizing Davos and criticizing elite corporations for embracing sort of cultural Marxist worldviews, to the extent that Rufo and others have documented. You see Elon interact with that. You see Bill Ackman interact with that. You see David Sachs interact with that. That's what people are interested in Ron DeSantis. They said he's a better bulwark than Trump. He's a wrecking ball. Look what he did in Florida with specific policies that sort of were, you pitch a DEI scheme at him and he's knocking it out of the park with some novel legislation. And I think people really saw him that way, rightfully so. But the lawfare, I think, basically clouded any of that. But just to sort of bridge the two things we were talking about and agree with you completely, I do think, yes, he was the stand against crouching illiberalism, even though I think, and maybe you do or don't, but just like sort of the perspective of whether or not the Stop Woke Act was perfect. No, I think it went a little too far. There were some things in there that I didn't love. But David French would pick those things out to say Ron DeSantis was the illiberal one, which is absurd. To say because this opposition to illiberalism isn't perfect, it too is illiberalism. I mean, it's just so stupid. But I do think, Inez, you're 100% right, that he felt like really one of the last best hopes for stopping the rise of illiberalism from the left and from the global elite.
I mean, I think a lot of people see Trump as the embodiment of that bulwark that you're talking about against essentially this takeover, institutional takeover. Because Trump sees everything, and this is his great weakness to me. It's both a strength and a weakness because, I mean, obviously his personality is magnetic and draws people to him. And there's something to that being sort of a feature that people choose in their leadership, whether it's democratic or not, over and over and over again for probably good reason. But I feel like Trump, because of who he is, because it's so personal for him, again, for good reason, they did come after him, like in a very direct and obvious and illegitimate way for 4 years. And then when he left office as well, that's what this lawfare represents. And I think to a lot of his voters, and I think they're right. But this requires, when you're talking about, let me back up. When you're talking about actually the most fundamental norms of the country, which have been destroyed and flouted, particularly in the case of Trump, in order to get Trump, right? We have generals in communication with America's greatest global enemies to circumvent the American president. Because that power was applied so directly to him, and because of Trump's personality himself, he's not like a circumspect person. He doesn't tend to think, 10 steps ahead or anything like that. I think he really does live life by the seat of his pants, and it's worked well for him so far. But it seems to me that there is a very, very delicate problem, which is how to essentially extract this ideology, extract a certain number of people, but more importantly, the best practices and the ideology from institution after institution without leaving nothing in your wake, right? Without leaving like just flattened institutions and nothing to replace them in your wake. And if I think about who's more likely to be able to perform what I see as that very delicate task of essentially trying to revive a traditional American form of governance, not, forget about what the founders would have I mean, we're so far off from their vision at this point that's almost but let's say to extract something that looks like would be comprehensible and recognizable as an American regime to people in, 1945, right? To pull something like that back out of our institutions, as corrupt as they are now and as ideological as they are, and as set against their basic purpose as they are now, is, to me, is a task that does require a scalpel and not like a wrecking ball. And I wonder what will happen, because look, I'm going to vote for Trump. Like, I think he is going to be that wrecking ball.
You heard it here
and
first.
The question is what happens after that? Because in a similar way as the left has been courting serious disaster by imagining that 75 million Trump supporters will evaporate if they just get Trump, I think we also will court disaster if we imagine that the people who hate Trump and are like hysterical about him will evaporate if he like fires all of the, everybody in Washington, D.C. I think we are teetering on the edge of something very, very nasty. I don't even want to say civil war, because I don't think it's even that simple, but like low-level political street violence, the real separation between red states and blue states in terms of ties and like overlap and any kind of common feeling as a nation, right? I don't think this is going to be red states marching against blue states. That doesn't really align, but to me, but I don't know. I don't see anything good in that direction. And I'm hoping that that's still a future that we can avoid. And I think we're less likely to avoid it with Trump than we would have been with somebody who's a little more careful, even as he's demonstrated that he's, very serious about fixing the rot in these institutions like DeSantis.
Yeah. I was one of the many people like in professional conservative spaces like you that had pretty much exactly the same take on the viability of the country under DeSantis versus the viability of the country under Trump, because Trump does have some legitimately problematic instincts for all of the good. There also come so many distractions and frankly, flirtations with a liberalism of its own, even if it is dwarfed by the illiberalism of his opponents who project all of their worst fears about illiberalism onto him. And I think one thing you said, I was thinking as you were talking about like how the very worst response, the most terrifying response to January 6th actually came to pass, which is let's censor more people. Let's marginalize more people. And I think that's why, those folks who are like on the right but don't work in professional politics looked at Ron DeSantis sort of, again, flirting with criticisms of Trump on the lawfare stuff when obviously the bigger story is the lawfare itself. Those sound bites weren't handled well just on a campaign like comms level, whatever DeSantis did. I mean, it wasn't an easy thing to deal with, but that wasn't handled well. But I think that's why like regular right of center conservative voters look at Donald Trump and say, I can't even think about voting for anybody else at this point. And some people, maybe did think of the idea of Ron DeSantis, but then as the lawfare started piling up, they were like, he has to be the one, because there's no way a career politician, even if it's Ron DeSantis, even if it's someone as likable as Ron DeSantis, but there's no way a normal politician is going to be able to stand up to these unstoppable forces that just want to destroy the country and are doing it so quickly, and see all of us as extremists that are infiltrating Catholic parishes just for the sin of being Orthodox, and associating that with white nationalism. I think all of that it makes me completely empathetic to people who are magnetically attracted to Donald Trump, even though I'm not. I agree with your assessment of the DeSantis situation, but at the same time, I get it.
And here I'll criticize DeSantis because I don't think it's I think it's letting him off easy to say that his sound bites or whatever around the lawfare were not handled well. I think it reflected a genuine ambivalence, which makes sense because he's running against the guy,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think what was required in that moment, and I wish he had said, was simply no. He should have said, this is appalling. This is well beyond, yes, I'm an opponent of this guy, and I think I can do a better job than him, but this is a totally unacceptable and illegitimate way to conduct politics. And he should have said, and I hope to beat Donald Trump legitimately for your vote in the Republican primary, and if I do, I'll pardon him. To me, that was the obvious way to it is exactly distinguishing legitimate politics and disagreement and political battles from the illegitimate way that Trump has been treated. Like, it's completely, and I don't understand why it's so difficult for people both on the left and the right to like distinguish those two things. You can say that Trump was the worst president ever. I think he was a pretty good one, but I could imagine really hating Donald Trump as a man, as a president, and still being able to say, hey, it's really bad that his generals were talking to China without him. That's not the way that we conduct and decide who's a good and bad president or who gets these powers in the American system. That's not for you to decide. That's not for that general to decide. What legitimacy does he have? All of his legitimacy comes through the person of the president that he's now circumventing.
Yeah, I wrote that he should have basically run the campaign when it came to Trump, just on the Trump question specifically, that Vivek Ramaswamy ran, because I think Vivek, listens to, he's sort of in the milieu of, people who make the argument that you just did, and that was 100% more effective. And then you'll have the sort of political establishment being like, well, Vivek didn't do very well. It's like, that is not evidence at all that it wasn't a better way to handle the Trump question. A lot of people who are coming to Vivek events just voted for Trump. And, people will say, well, okay, so if you graft that take to Trump onto Ron DeSantis, is he more powerful? Well, yeah, of course he is, because he's an effective sitting governor, not a guy who's never held elected office before, or not a guy who hasn't been the host of the Celebrity Apprentice, like a random person with low name recognition who's basically running a social media campaign. No, Ron DeSantis is a sitting governor with a huge war chest, tons of money, tons of interest from donors, even as that waned. So yeah, I think it would have made a huge difference if he had approached it in exactly the same way, because that's speaks to this primal sense of dread that voters, especially voters on the right, have about how the powers of the state are being weaponized against a political enemy. And it's not that Ron DeSantis is wrong to say that that would be a distraction from Trump governing effectively. I think that's probably a good argument to make when you're bogged down in these personal attacks. You're just going to fixate on them because they could put you in prison. They could put your family in prison, and they involve you directly. So I don't think it's an invalid argument. But I do think, yeah, you're right, Inez. It made it. That's one of those things that voters just sort of immediately are like, that's disqualifying.
Yeah, it's funny because it really does require not listening to consultants, political, whatever, chattering class type people. And, I'm not like, look, I don't advise political campaigns for very good reason. Because like, I don't know that my recommendations would be any better than any of these people's, but it did strike me that all of the analysis around his decisions with regards specifically to this stuff and whether he directly attacked Trump or not, everyone was constantly saying, well, he has to attack Trump. He's running against him. He has to say, and I don't know. If that's true, I at least wouldn't take it as an unexamined premise. What would have happened if Ron DeSantis had basically said, first of all, made that sharp distinction. There are ways to run against someone legitimately and illegitimate ways to try to take them out of the political process. And then it just said, yeah, I think a lot of things Trump did were great. Thought he was a really good president. I think he had several really key weaknesses that turned out to be really important. And that's why I think I'd be better at him. And here's my agenda. It's treating people like adults. It's not just a quote unquote horse race. It's treating people like adults and saying, yeah, I know you like this guy. That's the reality of the Republican primary going in. So you have to, I like this. I know you like this guy. There's a lot of stuff I like about him too. Here's some things I think he really screwed the pooch on. And COVID was like top of the list for Ron DeSantis on that, right? But also, you know, I think I can do a more effective job actually getting some of these things done. I think that was his best pitch. Now, would it have worked? I don't know. But
I don't think it would have, but it would have been better.
It also wouldn't have totally destroyed him. I think his like opinion of him in the eyes of a lot of Trump supporters, although maybe that's impossible with Trump like being totally himself, like totally illegitimately attacking DeSantis, like pretending that he's like an establishment hack or that, you know, his agenda is not conservative enough, which is absurd because it's to the right of Trump's, right? Anyway, I'm not sort of defending Trump's behavior, but I feel like it's all baked in with Trump. And if you're trying to offer yourself as an alternative, then you should probably improve a bunch on Trump, at least in that regard. But no, I don't know. I don't know if there was any way for him to win this, but I do think that it was a really important moment for him, that turning point with the lawfare. And if he had come out really strongly, essentially saying, yes, in the realm of politics where I'm running against him, I have all kinds of criticisms of Donald Trump. But if in the realm of sort of this illegitimate lawfare that's being waged against him, I'm completely on his side. And I'll do everything I can to make sure that he's victorious in that battle, up to and including, I will pardon him. If I beat him fair and square in this primary and I win the election, I will pardon him because this is totally illegitimate and out of bounds.
Well, it's what you said. It's the reason voters are completely on board with that argument is they have this sinking sense of dread about watching the country they love and that, you know, afforded them opportunities just go away, like fade into the night. And a lot of that is starting to see weaponization. And if you talk to Cubans, Venezuelans who are starting to have even more Republican voting patterns, you know, on the one hand, there's some reporting that they see in Donald Trump a sort of
Latin American strongman.
Yeah, that's been some of the reporting. But on the other hand, you get the reporting that it's like, well, actually, we've seen what this happens, and we've seen when this happens before. We've seen when the intelligence apparatuses and the oligarchs are weaponizing their powers against average citizens, and their freedoms are being curbed. Their voices are being curbed, whether that's media suppression or the sort of undermining of elections and the integrity of elections, all of that. So again, yeah, I mean, people just don't think it's possible for Ron DeSantis to reverse these trends because they are so dramatic, even though, again, and as I think, you know, I agree with you. I just, when I look at the polling and I see that the lawfare is when Trump started to pull away from Ron DeSantis, I think it's just like people say he's the only one because he is so, because he's Trump. He's the guy that was hit with all these lawsuits. That must mean he was the most effective, which means he needs to be the most effective and sent it again. Whether or not that logic is true can be debated, but I do think it resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that it does. And I mean, Trump's going to be the Republican nominee, barring some kind of horrible thing happening to him, which I really hope for his sake it doesn't, and also for the sake of the country, because can you imagine if Trump had a heart attack? Like, no one would believe it was a heart attack. It would be a disaster it would be an actual disaster. That's the problem. When you have a system where people's participation and granting of legitimacy to the political system is hanging by a thread. That's why I said before the 2020 election, I said, I can't remember if it was on this podcast or somewhere else. I said, you know, the best thing for this country, one way or the other, obviously I have a preference as to which way it goes, but I hope that it's a landslide. And of course it wasn't. And a lot of the mistrust has spiraled out of that. But yeah, you know, we for the sake of the country, I wish Donald Trump really wonderful health and lots of no pudding cups, no like wandering episodes, and definitely no adverse medical events.
But this is what's so, again, It reminds me so much of January 6th, the response to January 6th, which whatever you think of the federal involvement, we know based on reporting from the New York Times, some like 20 informants at least embedded on January 6th. So whatever we think about that, the bottom line is it was used as a pretense to crack down on people's civil liberties, and to paint a big swath of the country as extremist. And, you know, it's true that the people who stormed and rioted in the Capitol were acting as political extremists, and that was a radical thing to do. There's no question about it. But using that to then paint, you know, the entire group of Trump supporters, or whatever Hillary Clinton says, people need a formal like deprogramming. It's the same thing with the ends of all the lawfare, which is that they're crossing their fingers and hoping that Donald Trump ends up in prison, and that if they can prove insurrection, they can get him on the 14th Amendment removed from the ballot. They can keep doing these things, and it's going to end with Donald Trump being disqualified or in prison. And that's as far as they think. Like that's as far as they go. They don't think, okay, so what happens the next day? Do we get January 6th every day from there on out? Because people feel like the country is being stolen and taken away from them. And again, it's not to justify violence at all. It's just to say, you know, it's going to happen if you continue to overstep the boundaries of your constitutional authority, whether you are the Department of Justice, whether you are an oligarch, whether you are a journalist, whatever it is, the less you deal with why people voted for Donald Trump in 2016, the less you reckon with that, the more likely you are to make more and more people or the same group of people double down. You're going to bring more people over to that side, but you're definitely, in all likelihood, but you're definitely going to make people already there double down, and you're going to radicalize people because they don't think there are any nonviolent constitutional mechanisms, and that's wrong. But they don't, you know, it's easy to understand why somebody in middle America would feel utterly powerless against, you know, Zuck Bucks or whatever it is going forward, or the guy that president putting his political opponent in prison. You know, it's terrifying to think of the day after, and they've never thought that far because they don't want to fundamentally reckon with why people voted for Donald Trump. They just want to smear those people as racists and bigots, and not have to deal with what inspired those votes. They just want to purge the country of Trumpism, to deprogram the country of Trumpism and not deal with what put them there.
Yeah, it's look, the left has treated the system as illegitimate since the 1960s, since the New Left. And we've seen what's come with that. There's been many episodes of essentially violence in the streets. The Black Panthers were a group that treated as illegitimate the normal political process of the United States. It's not new on the left. It is new in, at least in the American context, in modern history, it is new on the right to have a substantial number of people who are at best one tiny thread away from treating the entire political system as illegitimate for a whole variety of understandable reasons. And I guess that does go back to why I see the sort of DeSantis-Rufo route as the last off-ramp from this. Because you have to relieve the pressure of people who are pushed to the wall. And the accelerationists or whatever would say, no, we don't relieve that pressure because we need the system to crack in half. As a small c conservative, I am much more worried about the day after the system cracks in half, even than about our current regime and the current way we live. Because again, it can always get worse, guys. And so that's in part, you know, why I do believe there is this paradox by which people think that the moderate course is essentially the safest. And I am coming deeply to the opinion, like very strongly to the opinion, that the moderate course and continuing the type of things that the Republican Party has done for the last 30 years is the most dangerous course, because so many people are pushed to the wall and so many people have their trust in the system hanging by a thread that more confirmations of the same is the most dangerous and most potentially violent course going forward. And that, in fact, if you had this full pedal to the metal, you know, very aggressive campaign to change the way institutions operate in this country in such a way that those 75 million plus people can live with it and feel like at least they are, you know, engaged in a legitimate political process in which they have the possibility of persuading and winning people and winning on any of the issues that they care about. That's the less dangerous course. And I think that is what DeSantis is doing in Florida, which is why you talk to Florida conservatives and they're actually like much chiller than everybody else. It's like the opposite. Like California conservatives like me are insane and radical.
That's always been true.
Because we've seen what handing over all the power to the left actually results in a very concrete way, and watch the state that we love disappear. Functionally, like disappear. It no longer exists. The California I grew up in, let alone the California my husband's family, you know, grew up in for 5 generations, does not exist. It just doesn't exist anymore. And that's a radicalizing thing. Whereas I see actually people in Florida, like, yes, they still get excised about national politics, but day to day, they're actually much chiller and much less radical in certain way, because they feel the boot coming off their necks a little bit. And the boot on people's necks is crazy making.
Well, and Ron DeSantis' approval ratings were not just high among conservatives. Like in Florida, he actually had a really high approval rating in general. And that's because, again, like it changed when he started running for president and the media started, you know, treating him in a different kind of context. But people actually really liked Stop Woke. They liked feeling as though there was an adult in charge who was resisting some really radical stuff that, again, the left is not dealing with. Even as Bill Ackman again comes to side against DEI, that's not quite going far enough. Or like Elon Musk is, you know, talking about how he used to, there's a really great honest clip of him being like, yeah, I used to be a Democrat. Like, I didn't change. You know, it's such a common thing that you hear, and you hear it not just among Silicon Valley people, but regular Americans. If you sit down at a bar, you'll hear the same thing. The party changed. But if you think that and you're still implanting Neuralinks, not just for medical purposes, but exploring it for other purposes, and yeah, maybe we still, you know, have an issue. But I think in terms of everyday politics, it's absolutely populist to be a cultural common sense candidate, and that's what boosted Ron DeSantis. He was A, common sense, and B, effective on the culture war, and it worked really well for him. And I don't think the end of his run for office, you know, not making it to New Hampshire, I don't think that is a reflection on whether or not that's attractive to voters whatsoever. I think when you juxtapose it with Donald Trump and add a bunch of lawsuits, it's not surprising at all that people are still siding with Donald Trump. But I think the future is still more similar to DeSantis. I don't think we got, you know, a good answer to the question of whether or not that's true. I think the best answer still was before the presidential primary.
Well, on that note, wrapping it all up from tech to politics here with Emily Jashinsky, as always. She's always with us on High Noon, the last Wednesday of each month. So every other Wednesday, you can find her at Counterpoints, and you can find her at The Federalist, where she's the culture editor, and she's a fellow with us, IWF. So you have seen her around. I list her various hats every time, but you should really check out not just her commentary, but her writing. When she decides to actually put pen to paper, there is no better cultural sort of commentary on the right, in my opinion. And she loves to write about TV shows and stuff, and also about the relationship of politics to real world problems. And so anyway, check out all of Emily's work. Really highly encourage that. And
That
thanks,
was so
Emily,
nice.
for coming back. Yeah, that's the nicest
That
thing
was
I've
so
ever said
nice.
to you.
That was beautiful. Thank you, though. Really, that was very nice of you.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to me, inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review. That really helps to boost the podcast. I really appreciate it when you do that. On Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.